Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the moral compass you were handed as a child, the one that told you what is good, what is evil, what saves the soul and damns it, has been quietly shaping not only your conscience, but your weakness. Imagine realizing that the virtues you were taught to admire may have trained you to endure injustice rather than confront it, to obey rather than to act, to suffer rather than to rule. The unsettling thought creeps in slowly. What if goodness, as you were taught to understand it, was never designed to protect you in the real world? You sit with that thought, and something begins to fracture. For centuries, Christianity has promised redemption through humility, strength through meekness, victory through surrender. Turn the other cheek. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The last shall be first. These ideas feel comforting, even beautiful, until you measure them against the raw mechanics of power, ambition, and survival. Look at history without sentiment. Empires do not rise because they forgive their enemies. States do not endure because they pray harder than their rivals. Power is not granted to the most virtuous. It is seized by those who understand how the world actually works. Now imagine living in a time where this contradiction is impossible to ignore. Cities burn. Kingdoms collapse overnight. Alliances shift like sand. Betrayal is currency. Violence is policy. In such a world, what value does moral purity have if it leaves you defenseless? What use is salvation of the soul if the body and the state are destroyed before redemption ever arrives? This is the tension that sits at the heart of a dangerous question. Did Christianity weaken humanity's capacity to rule itself? Not corrupt it, not mislead it, but soften it. Picture a man watching his homeland unravel, foreign armies marching through Italian city-states, rulers deposed, mercenaries selling loyalty to the highest bidder. He observes priests preaching humility while princes lose their thrones. He sees a religion promising eternal life, while earthly life grows increasingly brutal and unstable. And slowly, almost reluctantly, a realization forms. A moral system built for the salvation of souls may be catastrophically ill-suited for the governance of man. You feel the discomfort rising now, because the question cuts deeper than theology. It isn't merely about religion. It's about whether truth is judged by moral intention or by consequence. It's about whether a society can afford ideals that contradict the laws of power. And it's about whether goodness, when detached from reality, becomes a liability rather than a virtue. Ask yourself something unsettling. If a ruler follows Christian morality perfectly, always merciful, always forgiving, always honest, how long would they last in a world where others do not? Would their compassion protect their people or expose them? Would their honesty create trust or invite manipulation? Would their mercy inspire loyalty or signal weakness? These are not hypothetical questions. They are existential ones. Christianity speaks to the inner life, to guilt, sin, forgiveness, and hope beyond death. But politics deals with fear, ambition, loyalty, and force. One aims at heaven, the other must survive on earth. And here lies the paradox. A religion that elevates moral purity may undermine political effectiveness. A doctrine that condemns deception may leave leaders blind in a world built on it. A faith that glorifies suffering may train citizens to endure tyranny instead of resisting it. So you begin to wonder, quietly, dangerously, whether the rejection of Christianity by certain thinkers was not born of cruelty or cynicism, but of brutal clarity. Was this rejection an attack on God, or an attempt to save humanity from illusions it could no longer afford? Because once you see the gap, once you notice how religious virtue and political survival pull in opposite directions, you cannot unsee it. The comforting moral universe cracks open, revealing a colder, sharper landscape beneath. One where intentions mean nothing without results. Where goodness is judged not by purity, but by effectiveness. Where the greatest sin is not cruelty, but weakness that invites destruction. And if that is true, if the world rewards strength over sanctity, then the most dangerous lie is not evil, but moral innocence. This is where the real question emerges, heavy and unavoidable. Did Machiavelli reject Christianity because he was immoral, or because he was unwilling to lie about how power truly works? The answer does not come gently. It waits beneath layers of psychology, history, and human fear, waiting for you to step closer, to abandon comfort, and to face the hidden problem at the root of this rejection. If you want to understand why Christianity, in Machiavelli's eyes, could not rule the world, then you must first confront what it does to the human soul when survival is at stake. To understand why Machiavelli rejects Christianity, you must first strip the question of moral outrage and approach it as a diagnosis. He is not asking whether Christianity is true in a spiritual sense. He is asking whether it is functional in a political one. And this distinction between spiritual truth and worldly effectiveness is where the hidden problem begins. At the psychological level, Christianity reshapes how human beings relate to suffering, power, and responsibility. It does not deny pain, it sanctifies it. Suffering becomes meaningful. Endurance becomes virtuous. Weakness, if borne humbly, becomes a pathway to salvation. This is not accidental. Christianity emerged in a world where the powerless vastly outnumbered the powerful. Its genius was inward transformation. If the external world could not be changed, then the inner world would be redeemed. But Machiavelli is observing a different problem. He is watching rulers, states, and armies, not souls. And what he sees is that a moral system designed to console the oppressed becomes dangerous when adopted by those responsible for protecting a state. Christianity trains the psyche toward passivity in the face of injustice. It teaches the individual to internalize suffering rather than externalize resistance. Psychologically, this creates what modern thinkers would call learned helplessness, the belief that enduring harm is more virtuous than confronting its source. For a private individual, this may preserve inner peace. For a ruler, it can destroy nations. This is where Machiavelli's break with Christian morality becomes sharp and deliberate. He notices that Christianity redirects human aggression inward. Instead of mastering the world, the believer is encouraged to master the self. Instead of conquering enemies, one conquers desire. Instead of glory, one seeks grace. But politics does not reward inner victories. It punishes them. A ruler who prioritizes purity over preparedness invites domination by those who do not share that restraint. Here, Machiavelli's thinking quietly intersects with ideas later articulated by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche would describe Christianity as a slave morality, a system that rebrands weakness as virtue and condemns strength as sin. While Machiavelli does not use this language, he sees the same psychological effect. Christianity teaches people to admire humility, meekness, and obedience, traits that make societies governable, but also exploitable. Yet the problem runs deeper than obedience. Christianity introduces a split within the human psyche itself. On one side stands a moral self, the part of you that wants to be good, forgiven, pure. On the other stands a political self, the part that must calculate, deceive, threaten, and sometimes destroy. Christianity condemns this second self as sinful. Machiavelli refuses this condemnation, not because he loves cruelty, but because he sees that political action cannot be reduced to moral intention. This tension mirrors what Carl Jung would later call the shadow, the denied, repressed aspects of the personality that do not disappear simply because they are judged immoral. Machiavelli intuits this centuries earlier. He understands that when aggression, ambition, and ruthlessness are denied moral legitimacy, they do not vanish. They go underground. And when they resurface, they do so without restraint or accountability. A Christian ruler is expected to be merciful, honest, and forgiving. But Machiavelli asks a question that cuts through centuries of moral idealism. What happens when mercy rewards betrayal? When honesty arms your enemies? When forgiveness invites repeated abuse? Christianity assumes a moral symmetry, that goodness will be recognized and reciprocated. Machiavelli sees no evidence for this assumption in political life. Power does not respond to virtue. It responds to force, fear, and advantage. To act as if the world is morally fair is, in his view, a form of self-deception. This is why Machiavelli insists on separating ethics from politics, not to abolish morality, but to prevent it from blinding leaders to reality. Philosophically, this places him closer to Thomas Hobbes than to Christian theologians. Hobbes would later argue that human beings, left unchecked, exist in a state of competition and distrust. Machiavelli anticipates this insight. He does not assume humans are evil by nature, but he does assume they are unreliable, fearful, and self-interested, especially under pressure. Christianity, by contrast, assumes a moral ideal that human nature repeatedly fails to meet. The deeper issue, then, is not that Christianity is false, but that it asks human beings to behave as they are not. This is where Machiavelli diverges from thinkers like Viktor Frankl, who saw meaning as the ultimate human need. For Frankl, suffering could be redeemed through purpose. Machiavelli does not deny meaning, but he refuses to gamble the survival of the state on it. Meaning cannot stop an invading army. Purpose cannot stabilize a collapsing regime. Good intentions cannot substitute for effective action. Christianity orients life toward the afterlife. Machiavelli orients politics toward continuity, survival over time. One seeks transcendence, the other demands permanence. And when these goals conflict, Machiavelli chooses the world as it is, not the world as it ought to be. This choice feels cold, even brutal, because it removes moral comfort. It forces rulers to accept that guilt may be the price of stability, and that innocence may be fatal. Christianity offers absolution for sin. Machiavelli offers no such relief. He replaces salvation with responsibility. And this is the hidden problem at the root of his rejection. Christianity relocates moral judgment to God, while Machiavelli insists that rulers cannot outsource responsibility to heaven. History will judge them instead by outcomes, not intentions. This unresolved tension now begins to spread outward from the psyche of rulers into the structure of societies themselves. Because when a civilization builds its moral identity on ideals that contradict the mechanics of power, the consequences are not merely personal. They are civilizational, and that is where the real danger emerges. The most dangerous effects of Christianity, in Machiavelli's view, are not visible in churches or scriptures. They unfold quietly, in habits of thought, in emotional reflexes, in the collective psychology of societies that believe themselves moral while slowly surrendering their agency. These consequences are subtle precisely because they feel virtuous. They disguise weakness as righteousness and hesitation as wisdom. And because they were the mask of goodness, they are rarely questioned. Begin at the level of the individual. A person raised within Christian moral frameworks learns early that suffering has meaning, that injustice endured patiently is noble, that reward lies elsewhere, later, higher, beyond this life. Over time, this trains a specific cognitive posture. Tolerate first, resist last. Psychologically, this cultivates what modern neuroscience would recognize as avoidance conditioning. The mind learns to reduce internal conflict rather than external threat. Pain is processed inward, not acted upon outward. This inward turn feels peaceful, but it carries a hidden cost. When faced with exploitation, manipulation, or abuse, the individual hesitates, not because they lack awareness, but because they have been trained to doubt the legitimacy of their own aggression. Anger becomes guilt. Assertion becomes pride. Self-defense becomes moral failure. Now, expand this from the individual to the collective. A society shaped by these values begins to normalize endurance over resistance. Structural injustice persists not because people are blind to it, but because confronting it feels morally suspect. Authority is obeyed longer than it should be. Power is tolerated beyond its legitimacy. Tyranny does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it is patiently invited by a culture trained to sanctify suffering. This is where Machiavelli's insight becomes deeply unsettling. Christianity does not merely restrain cruelty, it restrains response. And power thrives in the absence of response. Look at how this manifests politically. A ruler educated in Christian virtue may genuinely wish to govern justly. They may avoid cruelty, reject deception, and seek reconciliation wherever possible. But Machiavelli asks you to notice what happens next. Rivals do not mirror this restraint. Enemies exploit mercy. Opportunists manipulate honesty. Betrayal flourishes in the shadow of forgiveness. The result is not a moral society. It is a vulnerable one. At the neurological level, this vulnerability is reinforced by cognitive biases. The just world hypothesis, the belief that good actions will eventually be rewarded, aligns perfectly with Christian moral teaching. But this bias distorts perception. It causes people to underestimate threat, overestimate fairness, and delay necessary confrontation. When consequences finally arrive, they feel shocking, undeserved, and cruel, despite being entirely predictable. Machiavelli sees this pattern repeating across history. States fall not because their leaders were evil, but because they were naive. They mistook moral aspiration for strategic foresight. They assumed others shared their values. They confused ethical intention with political reality. This blindness intensifies at the cultural level. Christianity gradually reframes greatness itself. Martial virtue gives way to moral purity. Glory is replaced with humility. Strength becomes suspect. Ambition is pathologized. Over generations, societies internalize this redefinition. Heroes are no longer those who shape the world, but those who endure it quietly. Action yields to contemplation. Risk yields to restraint. Here, Machiavelli's thinking converges with later critiques by Aldous Huxley, who warned of societies pacified not by force, but by values that dull resistance. A population does not need to be violently oppressed if it has learned to self-regulate its own powerlessness. When people believe suffering is meaningful, they endure conditions they should change. Even rebellion becomes morally confused. Protest feels sinful. Resistance feels arrogant. The desire to dominate one's fate is quietly replaced with the desire to be forgiven for wanting it. At the existential level, this produces a fractured identity. On one side, you feel the instinct to assert yourself, to protect, to conquer, to shape outcomes. On the other, you feel the moral voice warning you that such instincts are dangerous, impure, unworthy. The result is paralysis. You hesitate not because you lack strength, but because you no longer trust it. Jean-Paul Sartre would later describe this as bad faith, the denial of one's own freedom and responsibility. Machiavelli sees an early form of it here. Individuals and leaders alike surrender agency to moral systems that promise absolution in exchange for obedience. Responsibility is deferred to God, to fate, to history. But history does not absolve. It only records outcomes. This is the most unsettling consequence of all. Christianity externalizes judgment. Actions are weighed against divine standards, not worldly effects. A ruler may fail catastrophically, yet feel morally intact. A society may collapse, yet console itself with virtue. Machiavelli sees this as a form of moral escapism, a refusal to confront the brutal feedback loop of reality. And so the cycle repeats. States built on moral ideals collapse under pragmatic pressure. Their fall is interpreted not as a failure of values, but as a test of faith. Lessons are not learned. Suffering is reinterpreted. Meanwhile, less scrupulous powers, those unburdened by moral hesitation, expand, dominate, and rewrite the narrative. The cruel irony is this. Christianity aims to reduce suffering, yet when applied to politics, it often multiplies it. By discouraging decisive action early, it allows chaos to grow unchecked. By condemning necessary cruelty, it permits far greater cruelty later. What could have been prevented becomes inevitable. Machiavelli does not celebrate this reality. He exposes it. And once you see it, the question becomes personal. How many times have you tolerated what you should have confronted? How often have you mistaken patience for wisdom? How many losses have you rationalized as moral victories? If these patterns feel uncomfortably familiar, it is because the trap is not historical, it is psychological. It lives in the tension between who you are told to be and what reality demands you become. The pressure is now building toward a breaking point, because once the consequences are seen, they can no longer be unseen. The moral framework that once felt comforting now feels constricting. The virtues you admired now appear incomplete, perhaps even dangerous. And this is where the rebellion begins. Breaking free does not begin with anger. It begins with clarity. The rebellion Machiavelli offers is not a call to cruelty, nor a celebration of domination. It is a refusal to live inside comforting lies. It is the decision to see the world as it is, and to accept responsibility for acting within it. This is why his thought feels dangerous. It removes moral shelter. It leaves you exposed to consequence. And in that exposure, it gives you power back. The first shift is internal. You must separate personal virtue from political necessity. Christianity collapses them into one moral demand: be good, and goodness will suffice. Machiavelli tears them apart. He asks you to recognize that the qualities that make someone admirable in private life may be disastrous in public action. Mercy, honesty, forgiveness, these are not abandoned, but subordinated. They are tools, not commandments. They are applied when they strengthen order, and withheld when they undermine it. This is not moral nihilism. It is moral prioritization. To rule, whether a state, an organization, or even your own life, you must accept that outcomes matter more than intentions. Reality does not reward purity. It responds to effectiveness. Once you accept this, guilt loses its grip. You stop asking, "Was I good?" and begin asking, "Did this work?" This is the moment the internal conflict dissolves. The instincts Christianity taught you to suppress, assertiveness, calculation, controlled aggression, are no longer enemies of virtue. They become instruments of responsibility. You stop demonizing your shadow and begin integrating it. This is precisely what later thinkers like Carl Jung would identify as psychological maturity, not the absence of darkness, but its conscious command. The second shift is perceptual. You stop assuming moral symmetry. You no longer expect others to behave as you do. You assess incentives instead of intentions. You recognize that loyalty is often conditional, that fear can stabilize where love cannot, and that appearances shape reality as much as truth itself. This is where Machiavelli introduces one of his most misunderstood insights. It is safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Fear, in his framework, is not terror. It is predictability. It is the assurance that consequences will follow actions. Love is volatile. It dissolves under pressure. Fear endures because it is anchored in expectation. When people know what happens if they betray you, they think twice. When they rely only on goodwill, they gamble. The rebellion, then, is not against morality, but against naivete. You begin to understand why Machiavelli insists on appearances. People do not respond to essence. They respond to perception. A ruler who appears virtuous while acting decisively commands more stability than one who is virtuous and ineffective. This insight is uncomfortable because it exposes how deeply symbolic human behavior is. Truth alone does not rule the world. Belief does. Once you accept this, you reclaim strategic agency. You stop confessing power as if it were a sin. You stop apologizing for strength. You stop mistaking restraint for wisdom when the moment demands force. This does not turn you into a tyrant. It prevents you from becoming a victim. The third shift is existential. Christianity promises meaning through submission. Machiavelli offers meaning through authorship. Your life is no longer a moral test administered by God, but a project shaped by your choices. There is no external absolution, no final forgiveness that erases consequence. There is only responsibility and the dignity that comes with bearing it fully. This is why Machiavelli feels so modern. He anticipates what existential philosophers would later articulate. Freedom is inseparable from burden. To act is to risk guilt. To choose is to exclude alternatives. To rule is to accept that some will suffer because you decided. The rebellion is accepting this without flinching. At the practical level, this means cultivating virtue, Machiavelli's most misunderstood concept. Virtue is not virtue in the Christian sense. It is competence under pressure. It is adaptability, decisiveness, and the ability to shape fortune rather than submit to it. It is the refusal to be governed by fear of moral contamination when survival is at stake. You develop virtue by training yourself to act under uncertainty, by rehearsing difficult decisions before crisis arrives, by learning when compassion stabilizes and when it destabilizes. by recognizing that sometimes the most merciful act is decisive force that prevents greater chaos later. History rewards this clarity relentlessly. Leaders who hesitate in the name of goodness invite disaster. Those who act decisively, even harshly, often preserve peace. This is the paradox Christianity struggles to confront. Restraint can produce greater suffering than cruelty. Machiavelli does not resolve this paradox. He accepts it, and in doing so, he offers a grim but empowering truth. You cannot save everyone, but you can prevent collapse. The rebellion culminates here, not in domination of others, but in sovereignty over illusion. You no longer need the world to be morally fair to act effectively within it. You no longer need heaven's approval to justify necessary action. You stop outsourcing judgment and reclaim authorship. Yet this is not the end, because once you live this way, once you integrate power, responsibility, and consequence, another realization begins to emerge. One that reframes not just Christianity, but truth itself. One that reveals why Machiavelli's rejection is not a denial of meaning, but a confrontation with a deeper, more unsettling reality. That realization waits in the final section. At the end of this path, there is no comfort waiting for you, no absolution, no final moral certificate, no promise that suffering will be redeemed elsewhere. What waits instead is something far more demanding and far more honest. Niccolò Machiavelli does not reject Christianity because he hates goodness. He rejects it because it relocates responsibility away from the world that must actually be lived in. Christianity offers a moral universe where intention outweighs consequence, where purity redeems failure, where suffering can be justified without being solved. Machiavelli sees this as a dangerous displacement, not of faith, but of accountability. The ultimate truth he forces you to confront is this: there is no moral system that will save you from the consequences of reality. Christianity promises meaning beyond the world. Machiavelli insists that meaning must be forged within it, not discovered, not granted, forged through action, choice, and the willingness to bear the cost of those choices without appeal to heaven. This is why his rejection feels so unsettling. It removes the final excuse. If God guarantees justice, then human failure can be forgiven as tragic. If history alone judges, then failure is simply failure. And history does not care how good you meant to be. The deepest illusion Machiavelli dismantles is the belief that morality can be separated from power without cost. Christianity teaches that power corrupts the soul. Machiavelli replies, silently but firmly, powerlessness destroys the world. A society that refuses to engage with power does not escape it. It merely hands it to those less restrained. Here is the final inversion. Christianity teaches you to fear moral corruption more than collapse. Machiavelli teaches you to fear collapse more than moral contamination, because collapse kills indiscriminately. It erases innocence along with guilt. It does not ask whether the fallen were virtuous. It only counts outcomes. This is the truth beneath the truth. Ethics without force is sentiment. Force without ethics is chaos. Machiavelli does not choose one over the other. He insists they must coexist, but under a different hierarchy. Ethics must answer to survival, not the other way around. This is why his philosophy feels cold. It denies you the emotional relief of righteousness. It demands that you accept tragedy as part of responsibility. It asks you to act knowing you may be judged harshly, misunderstood, even condemned, yet still proceed. This is not cruelty. This is adulthood. Christianity infantilizes power by moralizing it. Machiavelli matures it by grounding it. He understands that the world does not run on what should be, but on what is. And pretending otherwise does not make you virtuous. It makes you irrelevant. Once you see this, the final realization settles in with quiet weight. The most dangerous lie is not evil. It is innocence that refuses to learn. Innocence believes the world will reward goodness. Wisdom knows the world must be shaped. Christianity offers moral innocence as an ideal. Machiavelli offers tragic wisdom as a necessity. One keeps the soul clean. The other keeps civilizations alive. And when the two conflict, Machiavelli chooses continuity over consolation. This does not mean you abandon compassion. It means you stop worshiping it. Compassion becomes conditional, strategic, bounded by reality. Mercy is no longer a reflex. It is a decision. Forgiveness is no longer automatic. It is earned. Truth is no longer confessed. It is deployed. This is the final freedom. You are no longer trapped between guilt and passivity. You no longer wait for moral permission to act. You no longer confuse suffering with meaning. You understand that meaning emerges not from endurance, but from authorship. And authorship is heavy. It means accepting that some outcomes are irreversible, that some choices stain the hands forever, that some peace requires decisive force early, rather than endless mercy later. Christianity offers salvation without responsibility. Machiavelli offers responsibility without salvation. And in a world that does not forgive weakness, that trade-off changes everything. The cinematic irony is this. Machiavelli is not less moral than Christianity. He is more honest about the price of morality. He refuses to promise purity where none is possible. He refuses to sell comfort in exchange for blindness. He refuses to lie about the nature of power to preserve a beautiful illusion. And once you understand that, the question that haunted the beginning finally resolves, not with relief, but with clarity. Machiavelli rejects Christianity not because it is false, but because it asks rulers to behave as if consequences did not matter. And in a world governed by consequences, that is the most dangerous faith of all. What you do with this realization is now up to you. Because no doctrine will decide for you. No scripture will carry the burden. No future redemption will undo present failure. Only choice remains, and the courage to live with it.